All right, welcome. We are breaking down 5 massive events from the early Cold War. We've got this set up perfectly to help you with your exams, so let's just dive right in.
So you gotta wonder, right? How did these two great allies, the USA and the Soviet Union, end up as bitter enemies? Well, today, we're gonna trace that exact story. We'll see how it went from words to policy to action, and finally, to some really brutal consequences.
Okay, to get started, we're going to use a fantastic tool for your exams. It's called the SPND framework. We'll use this to break down every single topic, packing our answers with the key stuff: statistics, places, events, names, and dates. Trust me, it's your key to getting those top grades.
So where does our story begin? Well, it's not with a bang, but with a message. The first real shots of the Cold War, they weren't fired from guns. Nope, they were sent by telegraph. And these messages would shape the hostile mindsets for the next 40 years.
And here's where it gets really interesting. You've got two totally opposite views of the exact same world. It's wild. On one side, you have the American diplomat George Kennan telling President Truman, hey, the Soviets are hostile, they're expansionist, you can't trust them. And on the other side, the Soviet ambassador Nikolai Novikov is telling Stalin that America's gunning for world domination. I mean, they were reading from completely different playbooks. And Novikov's report? Just as grim as Kennan's. He's basically saying the United States is this aggressive power, building up its military, and the only thing it understands is the language of force. You can almost feel the last bits of trust just evaporating into thin air. Okay, so let's use our SPEN framework here to lock in the facts. For statistics, Kennan's telegram was a massive 8,000 words long. Think about that. The places are the two big capitals, Moscow and Washington, D.C. And the dates, February and then September 1946, really show you just how fast this whole hostile dialogue blew up.
So why does this matter so much? Here's the key takeaway. These telegrams turned vague suspicions into actual official policy. They basically confirmed each side's worst nightmares about the other. And for the U.S., it gave them the intellectual firepower for their new hardline approach, containment. And that right there leads us perfectly into our next topic.
All right, so let's see how that thinking, that mindset, turns into America's first huge policy move of the Cold War. This wasn't just talk anymore. This was a direct response to Kennan's advice. It was time for action. Okay, if there's one number you need to remember for the Truman Doctrine, it's this: $400 million. And that wasn't just some random figure pulled out of a hat. No way. This was a massive, deliberate financial commitment to stop communism from spreading into two really vulnerable countries, Greece and Turkey.
And what was the big fear driving all this spending? It all comes down to something called the domino theory. The Americans truly believed that if just one country, like Greece or Turkey, fell to communism, it would set off a chain reaction. The neighboring countries would fall too, one after the other, just like a row of dominoes. Truman was absolutely determined to stop that first domino from even wobbling. So let's get the core facts down. The spark that lit the fuse? Britain, basically bankrupt after World War II, had to announce it couldn't afford to help Greece and Turkey anymore. So Truman steps up. He gives this historic speech to Congress in March 1947, and boom, America's role in the world was never going to be the same.
This was a massive turning point. Seriously. For decades, America had been pretty isolationist. This policy ended that overnight. The U.S. was now committed to a global fight against communism. And, of course, a move that big is going to get a reaction, right? This pushed Stalin to speed up his own plans to lock down his control in Eastern Europe.
And Stalin's reaction was all about consolidating power. You have to remember, Russia had been invaded by Germany twice in just 30 years. He was haunted by that. So his goal was to create a buffer zone, a whole bunch of loyal communist countries in Eastern Europe that would protect the USSR from any future invasion.
So how did they pull it off? Well, the Soviets used this incredibly clever and pretty ruthless method called salami tactics. It's a great name for it. They didn't just roll in the tanks and take over. No, it was more subtle. They'd slice away the opposition, piece by piece. First, they'd join a coalition government. Then, they'd start getting rid of rival parties. Then they'd rig an election. And before you knew it, a one-party communist state was in charge. And it happened scarily fast. You can see it here, across Eastern Europe, Poland, Hungary, Romania. The same playbook was used over and over. The final piece of the puzzle, the last slice, if you will, was in 1948 with a coup in Czechoslovakia, which had been a democracy. Suddenly, that Iron Curtain Winston Churchill had warned about, it wasn't just a phrase anymore. It was real.
Now let's look at the spend breakdown, because this one statistic is just huge. Over 2 million Red Army troops were stationed in the region. So let's be clear, this control wasn't just about clever political tactics. It was backed up by overwhelming military force. And to lock it all down, Stalin created two organizations, Cominform for political loyalty and Comecon to control all the economies.
For the West, watching this unfold just destroyed any shred of trust that was left. They saw it as a complete betrayal of the promises Stalin had made at the Yalta Conference about free elections. To President Truman, this was all the proof he needed. This wasn't about a defensive buffer. This was Stalin building a Soviet empire.
But here's the thing. This kind of control wasn't always accepted quietly. So what happens when one of these satellite states actually tries to break free? Well, in 1956, Hungary gave it a shot, and the consequences? They were absolutely tragic.
The Soviet response was just brutal and direct. Hungary's new leader, a reformer named Imre Nagy, does something incredibly bold. He announces that Hungary is leaving the Warsaw Pact. That's the Soviet military alliance. The new Soviet leader, Nikita Khrushchev, didn't hesitate. He immediately sent in a massive invasion force. We're talking 200,000 troops. The goal? To make an example of Hungary. And along with those troops came an absolutely staggering number of tanks. 2,500 of them. Just try to picture that. All that heavy armor rolling through the streets of Budapest. It was a terrifying display of power, designed to do one thing: crush the Hungarian revolutionaries. And while they fought back with incredible bravery, they just never stood a chance.
And this really chilling quote from Khrushchev, who had actually criticized Stalin's brutality, sent a very clear message to the whole world. He might not be Stalin, but he was just as determined to keep the Soviet empire together. The message was simple: challenge our authority in Eastern Europe, and you will be met with absolute force. End of story.
The spend details here are just grim. An estimated 20,000 Hungarians were killed. The leader of the uprising, Imre Nagy, was arrested. He was later secretly executed. It was a swift, brutal, and total crackdown. So what's the big takeaway from all this? The crushing of the Hungarian uprising sent two crystal-clear messages to the entire world. Message number one: the Soviets would do literally anything to keep their buffer zone intact, no exceptions. Message number two: for all its tough talk about containment, the USA was not prepared to risk World War III to free a country already behind the Iron Curtain. So there you have it. From mistrustful telegrams to tanks rolling through the streets of Budapest, that first decade after World War II was when suspicion turned into policy and policy turned into real-world concrete divisions. It locked in a conflict that would define the next 40 years. Which leaves us with one final big question to think about. When you look at how all this unfolded, event by event, was a Cold War between these two superpowers just inevitable?